So I would like to give everyone a very warm welcome to day 2 of ASBX 2021 and to our panel on physiological adaptations in space. And I would like to give a very warm welcome to our wonderful panelists who are with us today. So just to give you an outline of how things will run. First of all, I'll introduce our panelists individually, and then they'll have an opportunity to give a brief introduction to the work that they're currently doing. And then after that, we will go into our panel questions, and then we'll try to reserve some question for Q&A at the end. So I'm sure we're in for a real treat today, and thank you everyone for joining us. So I'd like to begin by introducing Professor Julie Hides. And Julie is a professor in physiotherapy at Griffith University. She's passionate about researching topics that have direct clinical application and can be readily translated into practice. Her research focus areas include exercise therapy for people with low back pain, musculoskeletal imaging, risk factors for sports injuries, and reconditioning post-exposure to prolonged bed rest and microgravity conditions. Julie is the clinical director of the Mater Back Stability Research Clinic at the Mater Hospital in Brisbane. She has been a member of 2 ESA topical teams and a researcher on 3 prolonged bed rest studies in collaboration with ESA. She was a member of the Academy of Science National Committee for Space Medicine and Life Sciences Working Group, and she is currently a member of the Australian Space Agency Space Medicine and Life Sciences Technical Advisory Group. So Julie, I'd like to invite you to tell us a little bit about your work. Thank you.
Thanks, Rowena, and firstly, thank you so much for having me here today. It's a real honour and privilege, and this looks like it's just a fantastic conference. It never ceases to amaze me how much happens in Australia with space research, and I suppose we were very lucky to have Gordon Cable to kind of pull a lot of us together in Australia with his first health colloquium. So my background, as you mentioned, is physiotherapy. I'm very interested in the musculoskeletal system. And certainly the terrestrial links between the research we can do with analogue studies as well as microgravity studies. And as you mentioned, my main interest is how to actually apply these on Earth in mainly areas of low back pain and sports injuries. And I teach physiotherapy students. So I love having examples from space. If you think of exercise, which is my area that I'm passionate about in research and teaching, when you flip it on its head and say to students, all right, well, how would you exercise if you didn't have gravity? And what does gravity actually do for us? I mean, they think of lifting weights, and of course, all our context is on Earth with gravity. Microgravity and bed rest are amazing examples to really flip this and get students to think of very interesting paradigms to do with exercise. So thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you very much, Julie. And I share with you a passion for teaching students, and I often get my medical students to think about what the lack of gravity should do. So it's really interesting to hear that parallel. So our next special guest I would like to introduce is Professor William Morgan. Professor Morgan joined the Lions Eye Institute board in 2018 and was subsequently appointed Managing Director. He is a consultant ophthalmologist at Royal Perth Hospital, consultant ophthalmologist at Perth's Children's Hospital, professor at UWA, and co-director of the Lions Eye Institute McCusker Glaucoma Centre. He has completed a PhD studying the response of the optic nerve to pressure, particularly in relation to glaucoma. He sees patients with glaucoma and other ocular conditions such as cataracts. Professor Morgan maintains an active research interest in glaucoma as well as the epidemiology of blinding eye disease. So Professor Morgan, I'd like to invite you to tell us a little bit about your work.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, my glaucoma is really a disease of pressure relations, particularly between the eye and the CSF space around the brain. And so I became interested in the CSF pressure quite some years ago. And over the last, I suppose, 10 years, have been working on ways to look at the effect of CSF pressure on the back of the eye, and also non-invasively estimate CSF pressure using properties of the retinal vessels. And then about 6 or 7 years ago, we became more aware of this problem in space, or with SANS, that's space flight associated neuroocular syndrome, which looked a lot like a problem related to elevated CSF pressure. So I've done a little bit of work with NASA over the last just few years, and also it's helped accelerate, in a sense, our interest in this whole problem of fluidic shifts towards the head and elevated CSF pressure and its impact upon the eye, but particularly in space. So that's where basically I'm at the moment. And thank you very much for asking me to join the panel. This is a terrific fun and opportunity.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And our third special guest I'd like to introduce is Dr. Hebert Carlos. Hebert holds a PhD in engineering, software engineering, and medical science. She's applied her expertise in biosignal processing, pattern recognition, and machine learning in complex biomedical problems, including epilepsy, cardiac and autonomic diseases, malnutrition, and human tactile physiology. Since 2014, she's been developing tactile sensors for robotic gripping that are inspired by the human sense of touch. She's CEO and co-founder of Contactile, a UNSW Sydney spin-out that is commercialising the papillary tactile sensor technology that is giving robots a human sense of touch and enabling robotic dexterity. So, Hebert, we would love to hear about what you're working on at the moment.
Thank you, Rowena. Before I jump into that, though, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I particularly work, live, and research, I suppose. It's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and like to pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. Thank you for that introduction. You might be wondering why an engineer is on this panel, but a lot of my work has actually been on tactile physiology, and looking at and understanding how people interact with objects and what it is that we sense when we touch an object and we start to manipulate it. And that has actually inspired the development of artificial tactile sensors, and how that's applicable, I guess, to today's panel talking about space and biology, is that in a lot of applications in space where obviously the astronaut is covered in lots and lots of layers of protective clothing, is that they fundamentally lose a lot of the benefits of our sense of touch. And the question is, how can we actually give them back that sense of touch and deliver tactile information to them in a way that's digestible and doesn't obviously use too much of a cognitive load which they need to be able to perform their tasks. So that's kind of my perspective on what I suppose we're going to be talking about today, and yeah, trying to deliver tactile feedback to people who have, through whether it's any kind of physiological changes or through even protective clothing that they've managed to lose. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. It sounds really fascinating work that you're doing. And our last final guest that I would like to introduce today is Vienna Tran. And I would like to congratulate Vienna that she has newly completed medical school. So she'll soon be joining the ranks of the medical profession. So well done, Vienna. And Vienna is a space medicine researcher who has investigated the use of artificial gravity for the hip muscles of astronauts during a prolonged bed rest analogue. She holds a first-class honours degree from the University of Adelaide. She regularly gives public talks and writes articles for spaceaustralia.com on space, health, industry and STEM. In particular, she enjoys engaging with visitors in her role at the Australian Space Discovery Centre. In 2022, Vienna will be working in regional South Australia as a medical doctor to further her skills in healthcare for Earth and space. And Vienna, I'd like to invite you to tell us a little bit about what you're working on at the moment.
So, my research project was about bedrest and artificial gravity. During my medical degree, I was able to take a year off to do an honours degree in a Bachelor of Health and Medical Sciences. And I'm happy to say that Julie Hydes here was one of my supervisors, which helped me get to the end successfully. The topic was looking at the gluteal muscles and looking at what would happen to them during a 60-day bed rest study, which was conducted in 2019 in Cologne in Germany. So I was able to get the data for that to do the research in 2020. And not only did we look at the effects of bed rest over that period, which simulated microgravity, but also what would happen if we centrifuge those people at 1G for 30 minutes a day. And I'll leave the results of the study until the end, but it was really quite interesting, particularly because we were the first study to have female participants of its kind, and we looked at the gluteal muscles individually using MRIs. So they all have different functions, they do different tasks. So we decided to look at them individually, which was more work, but a lot more insightful. So that was my research.
Thanks very much, Vienna. And now the next thing that we will do is to move into some starter questions for the panel, but I'm sure we'll think of other things as we go along. So the first question is whether we can truly rely on bed rest studies as a faithful mimic of microgravity conditions. So ideally, I'd like to let all the panelists sort of speak freely, but we may end up having to go one by one. But would anyone like to start us off on that one?
I can certainly talk from a musculoskeletal perspective. So having been involved in 3 bed rest studies now, whether it's a faithful mimic of microgravity, perhaps not entirely, but it's a very good start. And if we think of the role of the muscles and what happens to muscles and bones in space with deloading and decreased axial loading, which is a really huge stimulus for our muscles. And we have this whole set of muscles which is devoted to anti-gravity activity. So certainly if you think of space and microgravity, the huge difference between the analogues and the microgravity environment is that in space you can move around freely. So that's the aspect that we lose in bed rest analogues. And if you think of the bed rest analogue, it's not really mimicking space where you can move in any direction and think like the muscles you use when you're swimming underwater. This is merely flipping the axis 90 degrees. So whilst we don't have axial loading, which gives us a great analogue to look at anti-gravity muscle function when it's removed, really when you just move 90 degrees, other muscles that aren't normally anti-gravity are now anti-gravity. And even though they're in a bed rest situation, they still need to do hygiene activities, they need to eat, they need to roll over. So it is a good model in that you removed axial loading from the skeleton and the musculoskeletal system, but it does have some slight problems in that in reality muscles, and Vienna will talk about the hip muscles, are a great example of that. If you're rolling over or lying on your side, or you need to use a bedpan, there are still anti-gravity actions just in a different axis.
And
yeah, that's really interesting. And I guess I was just going to say, I've always wondered about that residual effect of gravity, what kind of role that plays. So thank you for explaining that. Sorry, Vienna, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No worries. Julie covered a lot of what I was going to say. which is great because we worked on the same project, so it proves I was listening. But specifically to the hip muscles, we have three gluteal muscles: gluteus maximus, medius, and minimus. And medius and minimus in particular are important for hip stabilization. And that's going to be working whether you're lying down or not, whether you're rolling over, or even if you're just maneuvering, you're going to be working maybe not against gravity, but just against the weight of your own leg, which is, I guess it's still gravity while you're in bed rest. So that's what we hypothesized in the study that I did, is really the artificial gravity intervention did not mitigate muscle deconditioning. And the losses that were seen during bed rest were probably an underestimate of what would happen in space, because the gluteal muscles were still being used, just in a different way and just less, but not completely. So I don't think bed rest analogues will eliminate everything for muscles. For other body systems, possibly, say the cardiovascular system, there's a very specific reason why they tilt the bed at 6 degrees head down. And that's because it helps the fluid shifts mimic what it would be in space, as opposed to 0 degrees head down tilt. I'm sure there's other body systems that the other panelists can talk about that where bed rest might be a good or not so good analogue.
Thank you, Vienna. And Hebert or Bill, would you like to comment at all on this question?
A little bit left field for me, but in terms of manipulation, gravity is obviously a very large contributor, because often we're working to hold something up against gravity. But there's also a range of manipulation tasks that we perform that aren't related to gravity. Like if, for example, you're using a screwdriver or something, the task of holding onto the screwdriver handle is, to prevent it from slipping in your grasp, and only, turning the screw. And so that's, irrespective of gravity. And so I don't think that gravity is a big contributor. It certainly contributes a lot to our planned actions. So when we're manipulating objects, we often have a feed forward mechanism, which, through our experience and learning during childhood, we've learned, I've done this before and this is how I did it that time. And so I'm going to try and attempt to do it the same way. But in terms of feedback mechanisms, all of that is happening in real time, and you're sensing things in real time. And so for that purpose, I guess the gravity is only one component of the forces that are acting on the object that you're manipulating. And obviously there's other forces. And so it's, you don't really care about what the origin of the forces are, as long as you're acting to prevent them from, removing the object from your grasp. And yeah, bed rest, it doesn't really apply in this case, because gravity is there anyway, and whether you're manipulating it, from a laying position or manipulating from a standing position, it's not particularly relevant.
Thank you.
Rowena, I can say something about the tilt table tests. They're not they're the best mimic we have on Earth for the microfluidic and the fluidic shifts that one experiences in space. Very much like what Julie was saying, in terms of, instead of the gravitational hydrostatic pressure forces acting vertically, you're basically shifting the axis of the body horizontally. So you still have pressure gradients due to gravity going through the body, but just at a smaller scale when you're in bed. I know, speaking with the guys at NASA, what they've had to do with their tilt table experiments is basically keep volunteers on a tilt table horizontal for months, and not even allow them to get out of bed to go to the toilet or have a shower. And to eat, they have to roll over slightly and eat, and the same when they get a wash, in effect. So, and even that is it doesn't mimic entirely what we see with, for example, SANS. You do get elevation in CSF pressure simply because of the hydrostatic pressure difference, but don't seem to get the chronic changes, which we presume are related to lymphatic and venous vessel changes, which are much more long-term. The problem with space is that there's no relenting at all from the absence of a hydrostatic pressure gradient, basically. It's there the whole time. It doesn't matter what posture you try and adopt. And there's no just changing posture and going into that lying position in space, or doesn't change in any of the pressure relationships. So I think it's the best mimic we have on Earth, and certainly one can learn some things from it.
Great, thank you very much for that detailed explanation. Now, I'd like to ask something. What's the significance of the 6-degree head down tilt? How is that determined to be the optimal level of tilt?
I'm not sure why that 6 degrees has been chosen. I haven't read into it. I'm guessing it's partly because the head is bigger than the toes, if you like, and so you actually want the head to be at or slightly below the rest of the body. At least in the CSF experiments, you want that. So 6-degree head down tilt provides that. But I haven't seen a rigorous explanation for that, basically. Julie might know. Julie, do you know the answer to that one?
I don't know exactly. The first Berlin bed rest, they didn't use a tilt, but many bed rests do. And 6 degrees is what's in that manual for bed rest studies. Yeah. So I don't know if there's actually research underpinning it or someone just thought it was a good idea. But I suspect that actually if you go too much higher, it's hard for the people to stay lying in bed.
Vienna, were you going to say something?
I also think it's empirical. I think that, like Julie said, that the first few bed rest studies that they ever did, they probably just experimented with either what's comfortable or what's the most accurate, and then they roughly tweaked it at 6 degrees, and then ever since then everybody else has been using 6 degrees. So sometimes that's the way that research goes, and there's no exact scientific explanation for why it's 6 and not 5.
Well, we've got an answer from a person called Kim Prisk, who is in the chat box, saying that -6 degrees is used as it sends the hydrostatic indifferent point. It sets the hydrostatic indifferent point to the position of the heart on the horizontal plane, and that would make sense. So for those of you who don't know, the hydrostatic indifferent point for CSF pressure is in the spinal cord, and it's classically at the junction between the cervical and the thoracic spine at about T1, T2. So I don't know if Kim is online. Maybe Kim would like to elaborate. Oh, we've got a hand up. I don't.
Yes, Kim, please unmute and.
Kim Prisk, I'm from UC San Diego, and I mean, this is historical. I've hung around NASA for about 40 years, so as a researcher, the hydrostatic indifference point for the cardiovascular system was really what drove the 6-degree head down tilt. This is all the stuff that John Greenleaf at NASA aims back in the 70s, frankly, the early bed rest studies or head down tilt studies that they became were set by that because the interest at the time was on the cardiovascular system, not on things like SANS, which of course nobody knew about at that point in time or anything like that. So that's where it comes from. It's not arbitrary. There was a considerable amount of thought put into it, but since then it's sort of become the standard, if you will, and there's some benefits to having a standard because at least then one compares apples with apples between studies. So 2 cents worth.
Great, thanks so much for that explanation. It's something I've been wondering about for a long time, so it's really great to hear that background about it. And there's a question in the chat which might be useful to feed in at this point, which is, what are the merits of water immersion studies compared to that of bed rest studies? Would anyone like to comment on that one?
I don't know anything about water immersion studies, sorry.
I haven't been involved with them either. I've certainly read about it, and it certainly makes sense to me, but I haven't had any personal involvement with water immersion studies.
If I may chime in, I don't want to dominate, but perhaps I've got a longer perspective than a few of you. Water immersion was used as an easy means of, again, in the cardiovascular system, abolishing hydrostatic gradients in the body. I mean, basically, you do it by, you've got if you put somebody up to their neck in water, you've got graded counter pressure against the hydrostatic gradient at exactly the same rate. So, you know, in that respect, it becomes an analog or a potential analog. I mean, it has its problems. For a start, you obviously really can't immerse much beyond the neck, or you get into problems, fairly obviously. The other problem is you can't do it for long term because you can't stay, you know what happens if you stay in the bath too long. The wrinkly skin syndrome sets in and you actually get skin sloughing going on, so it's a real problem. The Russians used dry water immersion quite extensively, which is sort of an analog of bed rest. It sounds oxymoronic, but basically what it is, it's a swimming pool. It's covered with a flexible but water impervious membrane that is loose, and basically you lie on top of the membrane and you sink down into it. And you're immersed. So it's a bit like lying in the bath, but you stay dry. And you can do that for long term. That gets rid of a lot of problems. The other problem you have to worry about is thermoneutral conditions. If you're in water in particular, you have a lot of body contact, and so you have to maintain thermoneutral conditions. Otherwise, which is about, if you're in water immersed to the neck, it's about 28 degrees Celsius, by the way. Again, it's one of those analogues that certainly works in some respects, but it carries with it a manifest number of problems. Hope that helps.
Great, thank you. And Julie, I see a question that might be good for you to answer. What are the preferred methods to measure muscle mass and strength? Asking because our US Army rotary wing aviators are advised to perform back strengthening and stretching to prevent chronic back pain, but no studies have correlated paraspinal muscle function measures with outcomes. Any thoughts on that one?
I'm just wondering with John's question. So this is outside of analog and microgravity. This is just chronic back pain for aerospace pilots on Earth. Is that correct?
Rotary wing helicopter aviators.
Okay, but on Earth, right? Yeah, interesting. Sorry, I'm just making sure I wasn't actually jumping tracks here. Muscle mass and strength, it's a little tricky, and without going into a lot of detail. When we talk about the analog studies and microgravity, I suppose the key thing that happens is anti-gravity muscles atrophy and atrophy quickly. And that's because they have a very different role. So for example, the deep multifidus muscle, it's highly reliant on gravity. It controls your curve, it controls the individual segments of your back, but it's not a huge torque producer. So when you talk about muscle mass and strength, it's not really a direct relationship when we talk about spinal muscles. And some muscles, I suppose the other fascinating thing about analogues and spaceflight and back pain to a degree is that not all muscles are affected by a loss of gravity or by bed rest. So we have these muscles that seem to be really linked to connect to the joints. They're deep, they have a lot of muscle spindles. You go to bed or you go to space and they go very quickly. Whereas you have other muscles that say, hey, I don't mind this at all, and they get bigger. So you're looking at an idea here of muscle imbalance rather than just atrophy. How do you strengthen them? How do you measure them? That's why imaging studies have been used so much for the spinal muscles, because some muscles atrophy and others don't. So when you think of back strengthening and stretching and preventing chronic back pain, it's not just about muscles being strong. So in summary, to a long-winded waffly answer, I'm sorry, strength is not the whole issue here. And if we think of protecting your spine, we have this whole set of muscles that is really specific to that function. And when we talk a little bit later about receptors and sensors in space, this is highly relevant to this area, because these muscles are like little sensors, if you like. So if my deep back muscles are working well and I'm sitting or standing, they're just buzzing along and they're saying, hey, you're in a pretty good position and we're working to monitor you. And if you move your segments, we'll control you. And you just think about what you need to do in your day and we'll keep you safe. Whereas if I'm in space, or if I'm lying down, or if they don't work when you're lying down, pain inhibits them. And again, pain inhibits them differently. So we have these whole sets of muscles with very different functions. Some are affected by different things. That is the terrestrial parallel, and why we are fascinated when we are back pain researchers by analog studies and space, because we have these different functions. So we certainly can use imaging to look at your different muscles, but it won't directly relate to strength. I don't know if that's actually answered your question.
That does, absolutely. Yeah, we really appreciate that. It's an issue that we face all the time. So that the long-winded answer is appreciated.
That's good. Certainly email me if you want any more information, or I can help. I'm very happy to help.
Great, thanks so much, Julie, really appreciate that. So we might go on to our next question, which is, why is non-invasive physiological monitoring so important in the space environment? Would anyone like to start us off on that one?
I can give you a little bit of an exercise perspective. And this is really interesting for us when we think of long duration missions, because currently exercise interventions in space, it relates a little bit to what we were just talking about, which is, without wanting to rabbit on about things that interest me and maybe not too many other people. If you think of these deep muscles and the little receptors that live there, and on Earth, they're giving us feedback. And Hebert was talking before about feed forward, feedback. If you think of exercising in space, they have developed exercise devices that they can use on the International Space Station. And in our astronaut studies, we've looked at preparation for space, what happens when you come back from space 6 months on the ISS, and then what happens after they have dedicated reconditioning programs. But when they're working on the ARAD, on the resistance device in space, they train for it before they go. When they're in space, they have a direct video link back to Cologne. And in the European Astronaut Centre, there's a physio sitting there watching them and trying to give them feedback. So we want to load them, or not me, they obviously want to load the astronauts to try and maintain bone density and muscle strength. But the little muscle receptors, muscle spindles that are in highest concentration in the deep parts of the muscles, they're not necessarily working in space. And as we all know with back pain, if you load your spine too much or in a poor position, you're quite prone to injury. So you have this direct video link where the person sitting there saying, oh, your chin's too far forward, pull your chin back. Oh gosh, you've gone into posterior tilt, try and correct that. So not physiological monitoring, this is human monitoring, but it's vital for them to do all that exercise on the ARAD and to try and keep some muscle strength in an axial loaded position. And I just wonder, when you think of the long duration missions, you won't have the ARAD, and you certainly won't have a video link, you'll have a delay. So that's probably the feed into how important physiological monitoring will be, I think, in the future.
Thank you.
I can comment on the intracranial pressure side. We are working on a non-invasive intracranial pressure monitoring system at the moment for use on Earth and in space. Basically, CSF pressure is probably the last pressure domain in the body that can't be measured without a direct puncture or drill hole in the head. So clearly you can't do that in space. Well, you could, but the complications and risks would be very high. And to have systems that allow you to measure these essential physiological parameters like blood pressure, venous pressure, various other cardiovascular parameters, but also, I think very importantly, CSF pressure will give us a much better handle on how, for example, SANS is evolving in astronauts in space, but perhaps as importantly, give us a handle on how certain interventions are affecting the development of SANS and other health issues in space. I'm just using SANS as an example. So there are some potential mitigating procedures that one could potentially do in space to reverse or somewhat normalize some of the pressure gradients, like wearing pressurized goggles, for example. And also there are certain hydrostatic pressure suits, which I'm sure people like Kim Prisk would know much more about than I do. But I think without having non-invasive physiological measures, then you're effectively sending people up into long missions blind, and you can't measure actually how certain conditions are evolving and offer them advice or interventions that make sense.
Heather or Vienna, would you like to comment on this one?
Yeah, sure. Non-invasive is really important in space because if you go back to basic principles, any open cavity in the body, fluids are going to come out, and they're much less easily controlled in space than they are on Earth. And then you get the infection risk when you're working to close that wound over some days, whether it be say an IV cannula or testing the intracranial pressure. And bacteria and viruses are more virulent in space. So we want to avoid infectious diseases a lot more in space than we do on Earth. So that's in terms of creating a hole in the body somewhere. A specific example which I find really interesting is to do with venous plethysmography, which is something that I recently did with my mentor Brett, who's in the meeting here. And to measure cardiovascular and hemodynamic parameters, one way we can do it in theatre by using an arterial line, and that can help measure blood pressure in situ in real time, and as well as other parameters. Something less invasive, so it's actually a graded sort of invasiveness. Something less invasive is if you use plethysmography by using a cuff and measuring the stretch of that cuff as arterial blood flows into a limb when it's being occluded. And that's good, but it's still contact with the astronaut, and you would probably have to have multiple different cuffs for multiple different limbs and for different people and their sizes. So another way you could do it, which I've read about, is imaging photoplethysmography, which is where a person will situate their limbs within a frame of cameras and LEDs, and the LEDs will actually measure the blood through their skin, kind of like a pulse oximeter. And that is very, very non-invasive because you're not touching the person at all, and different people of different sizes can use the same machine. And when we go to space, we need to think about mass, cost, and volume. So the more we can not touch the astronaut and the more we can cater for different people, the better it is for spaceflight.
Thanks, Vienna. That was very comprehensive and thoughtful answer.
I just have one additional comment, and it's not by any means my area of expertise, but in terms of invasive or non-invasive, there are a myriad of new technologies that are kind of injectable sensors with wireless transmitting capabilities and all that kind of thing. So it'll be interesting to see how those will be contributing to the future of monitoring in space. Just a comment.
Thank you. And one of the issues which is sometimes discussed is the whole issue of how much we should measure everything that's going on with the astronauts, and the sort of idea that from a psychological point of view that they stop feeling like people and start feeling like guinea pigs. And any comments on that one?
At the Australian Space Discovery Centre, we get visitors of all different backgrounds and ages coming in, and one of the stations that you can go to is an ethics station where it asks you how far you would go if you wanted to go to space. So would you For example, would you drink your own recycled urine? And some kids go, ew. And would you submit yourself to medical experimentation? Would you get rid of your appendix? Or would you forego other other parts of your body to protect yourself and prophylactically protect yourself from emergencies? How far would you go if you really, really wanted to go to space and be an astronaut? And some kids will say, yeah, I'd be willing to get tested and have needles and experiments done on me if it meant that I could go to space. So it's really, I think, about the motivation and what going to space means for you.
That's really interesting to hear that there's the ethics station there. That's a really good idea. Any other comments?
I think the amount of monitoring probably that happens during training of an astronaut far exceeds whatever monitoring happens when they're actually up in space. So I would imagine that there's, a lot of systems and processes in place that monitor their, psychological reaction to being poked and prodded during the training process. It's almost something they sign up for in essence.
If I may, I've been an experimenter on 7 shuttle flights and 4 increments of space station in the early days. So I have a bit of direct experience with poking and prodding astronauts. And it's a delicate balance. The missions I was flying on, at least for the shuttle missions, were science missions. And my goodness, did we poke and prod. We had to have blood sharing agreements, because if you took all the blood that were required for all the experiments being done, you would have exsanguinated the patient or the subject. So we had to share data. Those people were very long suffering, and there's a very big difference between that and routine monitoring of people in flight for health benefits. And then there is also the issue, and it hasn't really come up, which is that of medical privacy. These people, these astronauts, are entitled to the same degree of medical privacy that you and I are, and except that it's a little bit challenging. And how do you do experiments on people when it's public knowledge that who the subjects of your experiment are? We ran into this directly. How do we de-identify data, for example? Especially for the fact that you flew an experiment where you did measurements on 5 people, 4 of whom were male and 1 of whom happened to be female. Hello, I've just identified who the female is because there's public information about who the female was. So there's manifest problems there. And there's a fair bit of care exerted, I can only talk about the NASA side, about protecting the crew. And this comes into the psychological aspect that the moderator was asking about. There's a fair bit of care goes into limiting contact with the astronauts, limiting what measurements you make to those that are necessary. As I say, it varies depending on the science objectives of the mission. Science missions, when they occurred in the shuttle days, were much more intensive than for instance, a mission to launch a satellite or service a Hubble Space Telescope. So, but it's a very important topic, and it needs to be handled with great care, as does the privacy issue. Thanks.
Thank you. And Ian Kai, would you like to unmute and tell us all a little bit about onion routing and how that works?
Okay, I wasn't actually expecting to speak. So onion routing is really basically it's like, usually you're tracked by your, or your location is like tracked by your IP address, and then one thing about onion routing is that your information hops through 3 IP address, and so when this is done, the first node or the first IP address will only know who the sender is, and then the second node won't know the sender, or receiver, whereas the third node will only know the receiver, but not the sender. And so there is a good amount of work. So that's being used to, well, basically that's onion routing. And so onion routing has been used by the military quite well to make sure that they don't know who's sending the data. And so now they're shifting this onion routing procedures towards consumer applications as well as health data. So I guess that's what I wanted to say. I think Ken Pris wanted to say something.
I think, yeah, Kim's taught us a little bit about the NASA side earlier. So thank you very much. That's really interesting. I hadn't heard about that term before. So perhaps let's spend the remainder of the session looking at our last question and then any remaining Q&A questions. So the last thing to discuss is, how are our senses altered in space, and do we need to worry about this? So sorry about that, I managed to mute myself.
I can talk about vision. In space, if you're in space for even a few weeks, the pressure from the brain fluid pressure tends to push the retina and optic nerve forwards, and you become hyperopic. So it's common for astronauts to take a range of different glasses up into space so their refraction is going to change, and that helps to compensate for that. In terms of colour vision and perceptual side of vision, we don't know of any particular changes. I can probably comment on the vestibular and the hearing changes. There are some vestibular or balance sensation changes that occur in space as well. I'm not an expert on this, but certainly the microgravity affects the semicircular canals around the ear, and particularly at takeoff and I think landing, there are some effects there.
Great, thank you. And just for everyone, our last question is, how are our senses altered in space, and do we need to worry about this? That was a great start. So any other comments about our senses and how they change in space?
I can talk a little bit about the joint receptors, and that might lead into what Heber might want to talk to you about tactile, but that whole processing of those systems in space. And as Bill mentioned, the vestibular system, it drives our paravertebral muscles. So our spinal muscles, these systems are also interlinked, and tactile as well as joint proprioception, the little receptors, your mechanoreceptors that live in bones, ligaments, or mainly ligaments, muscles. It's actually for joint sensation. Your muscles actually give more information than your receptors that live in your ligaments and your joint capsules. So in space, from a musculoskeletal perspective, without muscle spindles doing what they're supposed to do, and without the vestibular system maybe driving our normal anti-gravity responses, you're a little bit at sea. And that is really important for us on Earth with exercise, because we're always getting people to use good form, for want of a better word, to load yourself safely. And that is reliant on you knowing where you are in space. Well, bad terminology, where you are on Earth. And that's why people use mirrors or other sorts of feedback. And from a neuro perspective, a lot of the rehab of people after neuro incidents is tactile stimulation. And a lot of PNF, or peripheral neuromuscular facilitation, was based on vibration, joint compression, tactile, trying to integrate those senses to try and rehabilitate. Think of all the polio research when individual muscles were knocked out. So this will be a problem for long duration missions for sure, because if you can't feel where you are well and you can't load yourself, plus gravitational loading is gone, you're pretty much set up for a fairly hectic time for your musculoskeletal system.
I'll comment, after that. Thanks for the lead in. No, I think you've hit the nail on the head. Apart from the actual physiological effects, I think a lot of it is going to be integration by the brain. So, you know, the brain is used to, obviously, you know, no sensory system is perfect. There are obviously limits to each and every one of them. And what the brain makes use of is every piece of information from every single sensor, and relying on the fact that congruent information is more, you know, there's more confidence in congruent information, less confidence in non-congruent information. And so if now the brain is receiving all these signals that, wait a second, this isn't what I'm used to seeing or feeling or you know, perceiving, proprioception, and that information is no longer congruent in the way that the brain is used to evaluating congruent information, I think that can be obviously very confusing and add to the, you know, lack of confidence in those systems. And so I think potentially there is an opportunity to train for this. Obviously, if you're exposing people and they're learning in microgravity scenarios, and basically you're learning how this, you know, the sensations will feel and appear in those microgravity environments, that might help to, you know, to almost train the brain to experience these sensations differently, or more similar to what the brain is used to seeing in normal gravity environments.
Great, thank you. Yes, Vienna, go for it.
Something we haven't talked about in terms of senses is taste. And I've heard from a number of astronauts that astronauts tend to spice their food a lot more when they're in the space station, whether that's salt or pepper or Tabasco sauce. And that's likely because of the fluid shifts going towards the head and congesting the sinuses. And because we need our sense of smell to support our sense of taste, then everything tastes bland to them. There are astronauts who have really, really enjoyed food on Earth. Some of their favorite foods have been taken to the space station and it's not so good anymore and they can't stand it. And it's partly probably to do with those physiological adaptations of the congested sinuses, but also the way that the food is prepared and cooked and packed in the space station, which is probably appealing to no one. In addition to that, you can't really smell the scent of the food when you're cooking it, and so it's not as much of a great sensation. The space station apparently smells like burnt metal or something like that, which can be very off-putting. And additionally, the stress of working in space is probably something that would add to the lack of enjoyment of food in space compared to Earth. So that's another consideration psychologically and physically.
Thank you. Yes, that's a really great comment and really important thing to mention. And I remember a couple of years ago, I saw a 2-part TV series, which was Heston's Food for Space. And he was making some special meals for British astronaut Tim Peake. And as well as making the food sort of desirable and good tasting, there are also little things like little cardboard cutouts to put around the food to remind you of the ambience of eating that food on Earth. So I think, as Vienna's highlighted really well, the sort of psychological side and the ability to enjoy food is going to be really important for long-term missions. We might just squeeze in a couple of questions before we finish, if that's all right with everyone. So the first one is a physiological one. Do we know if cerebral autoregulation remains intact in microgravity? Any additional comments on that apart from what we've mentioned already?
I don't know the answer to that one. I saw that question. I don't know if anyone's actually measured that in space. The measurements for cerebral blood flow are still relatively crude using Doppler ultrasound. And perhaps if Kim Prisker's online, he may know the answer to this, whether they've got such systems up on the International Space Station.
Well outside my area of expertise, but there have been multiple measurements of cerebral autoregulation. Look up Rich Hewson from University of Waterloo. He's done a lot. There's been some mid-cerebral artery velocity measurements, as you point out. They were done on Neurolab. in 1998. I'm trying to think of the investigator name and I'm blanking on it right now. But anyway, they're readily available. So there is a fair bit of literature on it, and the autoregulation is largely intact, although it may be altered in subtle ways, and I can't comment on that.
Great, thank you very much. And there's another nutrition-related question. If there's a lot of seasoning in the food, how does high sodium impact astronauts? So anyone on the panel have insights into the sodium content of the food, whether that has to be less than on Earth or more than on Earth?
I've got no idea, to be honest. I don't know about the food in space and the sodium content. Just intuitively, I'm guessing there may be some fluid retention, and that may go up towards the head due to the fluidic shifts. But again, if Kim's online, he probably has a better answer than I do.
Well outside my area of expertise, but I know the NASA food folks do spend a lot of time. I mean, certainly they worry about sodium and the food packaging. I mean, it's one of the challenges, Virginia said it, of making food not only palatable but attractive to eat. Tabasco is a carefully regarded resource, I believe. There are various important things for long-term space flight. Duct tape is one of them. Tabasco is another one. Those are very important in terms of keeping people happy. The food is carefully prepared, if you will, to maintain an appropriate sodium level, but whether that's, I don't know whether or not that's not, quote, normal sodium, for whatever that means, or whether it's low sodium, I don't know.
Vienna, I think you were going to mention something there.
I just wonder if it's interesting, Kim, that you said it's carefully packaged to maintain a normal sodium level, because when we prepare our food, we add salt to our liking, and more often than not, we add it. We can't really take it away. So in space, I think they just do the same thing as we would here on Earth. We add it when we need it. It just happens that they need to add more because of the dulled sensation. Having said that, our kidneys are very good at maintaining normal sodium levels. We do get hypovolemic in space, so maybe the increased sodium might actually retain some of the fluids, and that might not be such a bad thing. But it's a very complicated system. As long as it doesn't go outside pathological, like into pathological territory, I'd imagine it'd be okay. But long term, not sure.
I think that the point I was trying to make was that they don't give them a high sodium diet for obvious reasons. I mean, you don't do it to people on the ground, you don't do it to people in flight. Certainly they're hypovolemic in the context of 1G. They're not hypovolemic really in the context of 0G. They're perfectly fine. It's only when you turn gravity back on that suddenly all hell breaks loose, and you get massive orthostatic intolerance. And it's worth remembering that they fluid load prior to re-entry still, which means that they swallow a whole bunch of sodium tablets and drink a litre or two of liquid immediately prior to re-entry to try and prevent acute post-flight orthostatic intolerance. And people coming back from space station, you get varied responses. I've had astronauts after 6 months in space that come in the next day after they've landed and said, yeah, I'm good, fine. And another one that 2 days later had a flight surgeon under each armpit to walk in, to enable him to walk in the door. So, the responses are extremely wide, which is what you'd expect in the physiological system. And the individual responses are very hard to predict.
Great, thank you. It's really interesting to hear your insights from working directly on those spaceflight programs. Now, to finish, I'm going to put all our panelists on the spot, and I'm going to ask, is there something that you find really interesting or exciting about physiological research in space, and maybe something that you're looking forward to learning more about in the next few years? So We might go in reverse order. So Vienna, I'm going to put you on the spot first.
I recently found out about an interesting simulation device called the Caren, spent with a C. It's C-A-R-E-N, and I can't remember what it stands for. But you essentially put a person in a harness, and you sort of have them slightly off the ground, and that gives them, and you have a screen out in the front of them so that they can be doing various tasks. They could be walking over various different surfaces that you put on a treadmill-like contraption underneath their feet. And people ask me a lot about artificial gravity and 0G versus 1G, but what about partial gravity when we go to Mars or the Moon? I've never had an answer for that, but I wonder if this sort of harness device where someone is suspended a little bit off the ground would provide us with some answers as to how the body will adapt and work and sense the world in Mars-type gravity or Moon gravity. I think that's really, really emerging research that we need to look more at while we are doing microgravity research.
Great, thank you. And Hebert?
Yeah, less physiological, more maybe psychological, but yeah, I'm very interested. That's a very good point from Vienna about partial gravity. And I actually had this conversation with someone who's, even almost recalibrating our senses for partial gravity. And because, we underestimate how much we use our feed-forward mechanisms and our learnt behaviors and our internal models of the world around us. And so I'm very interested to, be able to hopefully monitor how people are actually interacting with the physical space around them in those partial gravity environments. And I'm talking obviously specifically about tactile sensing and manipulation, but yeah, picking up, it's like being tricked into picking up a closed container of mercury and thinking it was water, like that moment when you realize, oh, this is much heavier than I expected. And, vice versa in a partial gravity environment, it'll be the opposite, obviously, be like, oh, well, this is actually much lighter than I expected. And kind of, working around that, and how quickly do we adapt and do our internal models adapt to these new experiences? That would be really fascinating.
I definitely agree with both of those highlights so far. And I just relate a little story. One day I was in a cookware shop and I saw what looked like a cast iron pot with a cast iron lid. And so I thought I'll just pick up the lid to look inside. So I just picked it up and I thought it was a cast iron lid, and sort of suddenly it gets flung way behind me because it turned out it was just an aluminium lid that was made to look like cast iron. So it's kind of a fascinating insight to the sort of thing that you were mentioning.
Exactly.
Bill.
Oh, yeah, look, thank you. I'm very excited about the possibilities of understanding more of the physiology, the physiological changes in space. Particularly, it seems to highlight areas of the cardiovascular and fluidic systems in the body that are understudied. So I'd say the venous system, the lymphatic system, and the cerebrospinal fluid systems are both understudied. There's a great lack of understanding about those three systems. And in a sense, space is forcing us to look at those in much more detail and to develop quite sophisticated systems for taking measurements, which are actually very directly applicable back on Earth across a whole range of circumstances. So, for example, head injury, stroke, aspects of glaucoma, all of these conditions are to a great extent influenced by the CSF pressure. So I'm really looking forward to the sort of virtuous cycle of doing more work in terms of understanding the physiology of changes in space, but being able to translate that back to really practical, useful, clinical tools on Earth. So that's my interest.
Yes, that's a really excellent point about the translational potential of space research, and that's such an important thing to communicate to people as well. And last but not least, Julie, thank you.
Bill kind of stole my thunder there. I think the
Sorry, Julie.
the I think the applications of space research and vice versa is what really interests me. And of course, I think we'll learn a whole lot more with long duration missions, and my area being the musculoskeletal system. But if I think of some of the parallels between what we know from microgravity research and terrestrial research, and we touched a little bit before on neuro conditions, but the big one that's really topical at the moment, of course, is COVID and long COVID. And some of the devastating effects of people that have been ventilated for prolonged periods, we can probably really learn from that from a rehab perspective, to apply to maybe what it will be like after a long duration mission, or the vice versa would be long duration missions will inform wonderful new techniques, because people are generally innovative for how we will do rehab here on Earth for things like Guillain-Barré. But the one that really stands out to me at the moment, long COVID, because boy, oh boy, I can see physios being employed for a very long time with the ravages on you, every system of your body with long COVID. And of course, space is the same. It affects every system. So that's what I'm interested in at the moment.
Thank you, Julie. It's been interesting to read that some people are thinking there might be a parallel between long COVID and chronic fatigue syndrome type illnesses as well. So that's definitely a really interesting area. So I'd like to say a very big thank you to all our panelists for joining us today, and I really appreciate you making the time available to come along and participate in this discussion and share all your wonderful insights. It's been really fabulous to hear what you had to say and to have you all with us. And so thank you very much from me. And thank you very much to everyone for attending. And we might finish there, but please feel free to enjoy the rest of ASBX 2021. And thank you again.
Thanks, everyone. And thank you. I learned a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. That was really great.